Alright guys, today Jake and I are going to be talking about farm country bucks, and we've got this beautiful farm country setting behind us.
I think the thing about farm country is you could talk about it, in a million different ways, just because like farm country here is different than farm country where you grew up, and I'm sure it's a lot of similar stuff, but also different tendencies that they have. Like, I know you guys don't have like the big cattail marshes and stuff like that where you're from, but you have a lot of stuff that's real similar to the upland looking farm country around here.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll probably touch on some hill stuff, but I think we should kind of talk about flatland farm country, because there's so many states that you deal with that. I mean, really most of the Midwest is flatter than a lot of places we've ever made videos from. Like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin. Even
down to like where Bruce is from in Georgia. I mean, you can run into farm country just about anywhere you go, it seems like, and flat country anywhere you go, where it's just pretty limited habitat, especially when all the crops come off. And that really throws a loop in things, which we'll talk about, it seems like. But
what do you feel like some of the main challenges are, just at least from your experiences in farm country, that maybe are unique to that specific habitat and terrain type?
I think something I messed up a lot, especially when crops came off, we were just trying to set up where I kind of cut my canines hunting farm country, I guess, is like we were parking right where we were set up at, and we were walking across that field right to wherever we were going. And after thinking back and looking back and traveling around a bunch, it's like the deer were just watching us do that for the most part. I mean, we got lucky a couple times, and they must have been bedded somewhere where they couldn't see where we were accessing from. But especially in that flat stuff, they'll get up on the little bit of elevation that there was, especially the bucks. And they were watching us come in, I'm sure, and just either just sitting tight and probably not getting up, or just slipping out the other way. But
I think that's a huge deal.
Yeah,
it's something that, even looking at this setting right here, you think about it, why would they bury themselves where they can't see anything? Instead, they would rather, in most situations at least, bed right on the edge of something to where they can see a really long way. And especially if there's tendencies of hunters, if they're parking in a specific spot, they'll just keep watching that.
And it seems like the bucks especially will kind of isolate themselves from, got a plane flying over real low. It's like he hit the gas right when he got past us there. But it seems like the bucks specifically too will like isolate themselves from the rest of the deer, especially when it's not during the rut, and really at all times of the year, but especially early season, like throughout the summer and early season. It seems like you'll catch them in spots that they shouldn't be, just like a weird fence line or a small little island that's in the middle of a big field, where they're not in like I'm looking at 15-acre woodlot right there, which is probably where a majority of your deer population is going to be. And they might be in there sometimes, but the places that I've found them more so, and especially killed them, is just off away from the rest of the deer in those little drainages maybe that run along a waterway that's not, 10 yards wide, 15 yards wide, but there's enough cover, especially with there being standing corn on, both sides of it, where they feel comfortable. There's not a lot of people going back in there. It can't be seen from the road. And they have, all the stuff they need to stand up and browse throughout the day right next to water. That's where feel like I've caught, bucks, especially when it's not during the rut, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that a challenge can be overcome. It's a challenge that can be overcome, but we always want to hunt in the woods as deer hunters. And looking back to my days hunting farm country around where I grew up, I'd always want to be in the woods, and I completely overlooked so many areas that were these isolated pockets where, looking back on it, I think a lot of the bucks were using those a lot of times. Now, we still, like you
really
mentioned,
going directly to them from wherever they're if they're not bedded in there, like that's where they're going to go straight to, because that's where probably most of the food is, and that's where most of the deer are. They're going to go there and meet up and communicate with the rest of the deer, just check in on, who's around, what's around, and, go to a bulk of where maybe the acorns and stuff is falling. But I feel like, especially early season, they don't like the stress of having a bunch of other deer around, like especially a big buck. He's maybe going to be just bedded off with a younger buck, or if you're lucky, maybe there's a couple big bucks running together, and then a pesky little 1.5-year-old buck that's just hanging around them just because That's probably a good idea for him, I guess. But
good learning. Oh no, our GoPro's down. I can't believe our bricks fell, dude. Time out.
It seems like around here the best time to capitalize on that stuff, because when crops come out, that maybe they're using a certain spot that you have permission to, which was my case a lot. It's like they might be there, until the crops come out, and then they're around here. They're probably going to some wetland stuff, or just like a bigger chunk of timber, which I never had permission, anything like that. It was mostly just fence lines and just a majority of it's field, and then maybe you got a waterway that they'll bed in sometimes. Or they'll bet on the neighbors, and you're just hoping to catch them on a good weather day coming over to where you got permission to, stuff like that. But I feel like timing is also real important for spots like that. Like you don't want to go in there until you got some sort of intel that's telling you that you should be going in there. Even if you're getting pictures or driving around shining at night, if they're not there like right after, I guess I was trying to time it up where, maybe they're flirting with being there during daylight, and you got a cold front that's kind of pushing in. Then whatever day makes most sense with that cold front, that's when you're kind of trying to strike. Just because I never really was hunting spots where deer were directly bedded on a place I could hunt for the most part. Usually you're waiting for them to come across the property line, which maybe they were only bedded 100 yards away, but unless it's real good weather, a lot of times the mature buck's not moving further than that, it doesn't seem like, until the rut's kicking in. They're just kind of living their life in 200-yard bubble, really. It seems like.
I also think, on the note of the isolation thing, you said deer will go to those bigger tracts of timber to communicate, meet up with other deer, and it can be confusing when you're trying to read sign. You get to that big woodlot, and it's blown up with sign.
Yeah.
But I feel that in a lot of cases, that sign is just being laid down at night, and therefore it's easy to get hung up on that timber because, again, you got a place to hang your stand. You've got a lot of times food sources like acorns, and you might even be seeing a lot of other deer in those places.
For sure.
I think that's a big hang up is like, well, I see the most
deer.
Deer.
And that's where the term he's nocturnal comes from too. He's not nocturnal, he's just not bedded. Maybe on the place you can hunt even, and then you just got to, like I said, try to time it out the best you can, where maybe he's coming in, late October, I guess it'd be around here. He's coming in to check those first couple does. But if you're going in there and hunting a bunch, those couple does that were in there probably aren't going to be bedding there as consistently either. So that's why I think timing is super important. And I guess if you're after an older buck, and maybe Joe talked with you about this today too, you might be just not even hunting a certain spot. Like Zimmy owns a bunch of stuff around here that, they own majority of its field, but, he runs a lot of cameras, and maybe you got a 2-year-old buck that's there a bunch. It's like I don't think that's necessarily what he's after. I mean, he'll shoot one if that's what presents itself, but I think he's generally trying to target a little older buck. But that deer's probably going to be doing something real similar the next year if the crop rotation's the same. So you're kind of keeping tabs on that type of stuff too, like what time frame that buck is utilizing that property, and maybe when he moves through there during daylight, if you're lucky enough for that to happen. But I don't know. It's I think that's where it's important to have a bunch of different spots you can bounce around to too, because you don't want to just not be hunting.
Yeah. Hold up. Windbreak. It's really like pretty good for the most part though, because I got mine cranked so I can hear it, and I don't think it's gonna be too big of a deal. Help!
He might bump out behind us here.
It'd be actually so hilarious. We're sitting here filming this, and all of a sudden you can just see a tom strutting behind us. Could you see it?
In that one you could.
Yeah, I guess you could right here too.
I kind of tried to point at the directions he's going to come out when he does.
For his evening strut. What were you saying?
But I think that's why it's important. I mean, we talk about this all the time, whether you're hunting public or maybe you got permission to farm a bunch of different farmland stuff, or if you don't, you should try to be getting as much as you can, I'd say, just to, for one, keep the pressure off of spots. If you can't, the more you can bounce around, the less pressure you're going to have to put on certain spots. And you're always just going to have options too then. Like maybe it'll be 3 or 4 years before, a spot like this will have a buck that you even want to shoot that's living on it, but then all of a sudden, something shows up that you want to shoot, or he just like wasn't there all year, and then you go out there to check a camera or something like that. You're driving past and you see one out there, it's game on,
Yeah. I feel that one of the other challenges of farm country is finding enough places to participate. Like when I was a kid, it was pretty competitive in that immediate area, but then there was a few places where I could go, but so could everybody else. And I feel that one thing that I regret, and just getting more experience hunting in different areas, when I look back on those days, one of the things that I really wish I would have done is just committed a whole bunch of time in the off season to finding as many opportunities to go hunting as I could, even if it didn't look that good. Like you said, there's certain times of the season, or
if it's within a couple 100 yards or even
a couple miles
of something that's good, or between two places that are really good. I mean, if you live in farm country, you've probably seen it, a buck just tearing off across the middle of a field. I mean, just put a decoy out and sit and wait. I mean, that might be your best option. I mean, if something gets eyes on it while it's out there making a dash like that, obviously he's in some sort of mood looking for something. I mean, as long as the wind's good, I'd say you got a pretty good chance of decoying a buck in later in the year like that. Really any time of year, but that's when it seems like you're going to catch something doing something real dumb like that. But
I think one thing that really is unique to the strategy that I used to put into place in farm country was hunting from a distance, or not really even hunting. More just cruising around, watching until I could nail down a pattern, because I have a lot of memories, and I've told you the story all the time about that one year where everything did fall into place, in a place where I could hunt. It was actually one of those places where everybody could go. There was tons of tree stands in that woods, and that particular year there was tons of corn left over, and deer were coming in from all over the place. There had to have been bucks that were coming in from over 5 miles. There's just no way there's that many deer around all season. I mean, the carrying capacity is not that large. But at that time...
Because how big is the woodlot you're talking about, would you guess?
30 acres would be the southern one, and the other one's bigger. It's probably more like 100 maybe. It's actually a pretty big one for the area. But the land that I could hunt was not, the whole... They didn't own the whole woodlot, I guess. It was a property line through the middle of it, and the deer were there a lot of years, and they had kind of their tendencies. They had kind of areas that they would hit on and off, and I feel like that one season, it was kind of the last season I really ever hunted there, was just crazy because everything worked out. Found that all the deer were coming there to feed. There was nobody hunting there because it was super late season, and everybody was just probably burnt out. And apparently nobody else was driving around, because I don't know how. I mean, man, even if you hadn't bow hunted for weeks, months, like it would be hard not to pick it up and try it, because there were just deer coming from all over. One night I witnessed 3 bucks that I would have shot coming from where there's no timber. Like there's no timber for multiple miles. And I think I caught them day of going in there, because then I saw them every day that I would see, that I would cruise around there. I saw them every day after that. And I just think back to how valuable that time scouting was, and how much different I would play it now too. Like one morning I watched them go into a bedding area, and I knew exactly where there was multiple shooter bucks. It was at least 2 of those 3 that I saw that morning popping around the edge of that bedding area. I could just glass right into the timber corner where they would bed, which I want to talk about timber corners too, or like isolated points or anything like that. But that timber corner was a consistent bedding location. I jumped them out of there. I'd hunted them in there. There were always potential that there was deer there. And that night when I went in to hunt, I set up like way the hell across there. I was like 400 yards away from them, and it's like, why was I doing that? I could have, as of today, I would have spent the entire rest of the day crawling in there, but I waited and I played a safer move, but I still actually crawled across that field, and I think that kind of plays back into that access thing. And I ended up having one of the craziest hunts that I've had in the late season, especially in that area. Hands down the craziest hunt I ever had in that area. I saw that night 50 some deer, and at last light, or well, just after end of legal, the bucks came underneath me. But I should have just pushed in tighter. But
yeah.
That whole glassing from a distance is something that I feel if I could go back, or if I was put into a situation where that was my entire season, I would play things so patient. I would be the guy that wouldn't really even hunt that much. I mean, hunt, I guess.
Yeah.
I'd be in the car a lot.
Yeah.
I'd get done with work, an hour before dark, cruise to all my spots.
Yeah.
Show up home late after work, just every day. I'd try to do that as often as I could. And then you would probably pick up on patterns just from afar, just locating, certain areas that deer would be feeding in or moving from. And I think that gives you a base to start on. And with so much visibility in a place like flatland farm country, you're not necessarily going to nail him down, but you might pick up on some things. You might see one. You might locate one doing that.
Yeah.
And I just feel like that is something that I look back on and thought was fun when I did it. I think it's fun when I do it to this day, and I would just do like crazy if I had a whole season to hunt farm country again.
I think you can definitely get eyes on stuff too, especially if you're just thinking a little bit outside the box. I mean, just getting even 50 yards up on a knoll where you can't see the spot from the road, but then you just walk up to a little higher spot or something like that. Like, I can think of deer around here that have lived under my nose the whole summer until it's like, all right, I know they're around here somewhere. I haven't seen them in a while. Like, there's a bachelor group of bucks down the road here a couple summers ago. It's like, I know I've seen them 2 or 3 times from the road, and like, they got to be here more consistently than what I'm seeing them. And so me and Zimmy started slipping up one of his fence line. There's just a bunch of mature oaks that are along it, and I guess it was corn on the north side, beans on the south side of that fence line. So they got, and then there's a low spot in the bean field, and they were kind of back there in that low spot where you can't see them at all from the road. And where those beans were still low, it was all green still. The whole field was yellow, but that little pocket in the low area, since those big oaks were casting shade over it, stayed real green even into the season. But it's like, if we had just been even more lazy than what we had been being, I guess, it's like we would never know. And it's like, that's not a farm that we ever really deer hunt. It's just like that year that there was bachelor groups of buck using it because everything's set up right for it. And I mean, him and my brother hunted it while we were elsewhere. I was elsewhere hunting, but him and my brother hunted them for a couple weeks, and just kind of picked their way at them and got close a couple times. But it's just, I guess that's where, like, getting permission to a bunch of different spots comes in too. It's like I said, that's not a place that consistently has bucks, but there was two bucks that were probably 4 or 5 years old down there and living that summer into the season a little bit. So
a couple other things that came to mind when you were saying that, like you talked about the knoll, getting up on a knoll, being able to glass a little bit more, but also take advantage of man-made structures like silos, or we even talked about getting up on a water tower over by your place. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that you can do to get yourself elevated, and even making observation sits. I mean, we're sitting here and I'm looking at a tree right across the road right behind you there, where you could climb that tree. Odds of you actually shooting a deer almost
just
none.
have a nice big comfy ladder up, going up into it where you can get real high. But like, especially like we're talking about in flat farmland country like that, you get 20, 30 feet in some of these spots. I mean, you're gonna be able to see a mile plus. So definitely having good optics too makes a difference. Like, it would probably be worth saving up for a spotter at some point and getting something where you can mount it to your window on your vehicle. Vortex makes a nice little thing that I've been using a lot, and then a tripod also. It's like, you're going to be able to probably pick out bucks that are bedded down in little pockets when the crops come off that you never see otherwise,
Even taking a camera arm or something, like some sort of tree arm up into a tree to put your spotter on is something I've considered doing. I haven't done it yet, but I've definitely thought to myself that's
definitely something I'd be doing a lot more now than I wasn't doing when I was younger, just because I didn't even have a pair of binoculars. So like,
when we first started hunting together, you didn't take binoculars with you.
Just never even had them. So I'd definitely be, setting up, like you're saying, I'd have my bow with me, or I might just be in the vehicle, but I'd be glassing a specific spot where preseason scouting had told me that a buck beds here sometimes, just trying to catch them in there. And then, I mean, you don't even have to set foot in there. You don't need a camera, nothing. You can just be glassing the bed or the small pocket that they're bedding in. If he's there that day, you can try to make a stalk if if the weather suits, or maybe you just say, all right, he's in there today. Hopefully he's in there on the day where I got more time and the weather's better. Mm-hmm. That's definitely a strategy I'd be using a lot more now that I never would have before, I guess.
Mm-hmm. It's like, I got time to go hunt, I'm going to go hunt. We talk about that when we're on out-of-state trips and we're traveling, is, we pick away at finding new spots, and we act like we wouldn't do that if we were hunting around home, but we still would. If this was a place that I was going to hunt for the entire season again, I would be in no rush until I found something I really wanted to dive into, because again, if one of the challenges is that you don't have tons of acreage to go, you don't want to just go blowing deer every single chance you get.
Yeah.
And not to say that we wouldn't hunt aggressively either, which I think is something that we could
I think you'd have to recognize like what the potential is for the deer to be back in that spot, I guess. So like they got pretty ultra, like I was talking back and forth with them on this bachelor group. I was kind of just living through whatever they were telling me, but that was a situation where it's just like, all right, I would get ultra aggressive, because whenever that corn and beans comes out in that fence line of yours, like small chance that they're going to be, that wouldn't make sense for them to want. They're putting themselves in a pretty bad position, and there's enough other stuff around that's like pretty high quality habitat where they can just kind of disappear into that until next summer, basically. So in that situation like that, it's like you only got basically until the crops come out, and they ended up getting real aggressive towards the end. It was my brother ended up laying down in the bean field that was, just 30-inch rows. That one was still pretty green too. It ended up being on the backside of Zimmy's, and Zimmy was up on a hill above my brother, and he's like signaling to him when to lean up to like the buck's walking down the fence line. This is the closest I got to it, just because the wind's blowing out across the open field. They can't set up on the fence line because the buck's walking the fence line eating acorns, and they'll smell them or bust him as he'd have to be shooting him. So they figured it made more sense to just be out there, and Jim rose up, and he could never, Zimmy was a little higher on the hill behind him, and Jim could never see the buck, but apparently it was just like 30 yards in front of him, then he just kind of disappeared. So
Zimmy told me that story during sturgeon spearing with 15 times the detail that you just did. But point is that's exactly what happened in a nutshell. But Jimmy told me that same story and just told me every last moment that happened. But it was a good learning experience.
Plus 15 beers deep. That was probably a real good story.
But the thing that I think is interesting as far as bedding goes, so we talk so much about bedding specific things in hill country or big timber settings, and obviously what we're talking about with the farm country is very different. One thing that I've always been a little interested in is there's always a comparison, like, well, this in our area, this doesn't happen, or over here, this happens, or you guys, better yet, it's like, you guys get this and we don't. Well, along those lines of being aggressive when the timing's right, because when the crops come out, it's going to change everything. It's the same deal in farm country as it is anywhere. Like, deer may be here one day and 5 miles over here another day, just the same as they would be in a big timber setting in the eastern mountains, for example. And I just think that deer move. There's a lot of reasons that they would move, and sometimes it's pressure, sometimes it's not related to that at all.
Just because they can. It's been interesting watching that MSU Deer Lab stuff, or I don't even know what it's called, but they got Mississippi has that, all the collared deer that they've been releasing the tracks of, and they just got like 2 or 3 minute videos on YouTube, and I think they post some stuff on their social media too. But basically they classified or broke bucks down into basically 2 different types. I mean, obviously all of them have different tendencies, but for the most part they're just like a core area buck or a roamer, and they call them something different, but they're either living their life in a pretty small acreage or they're just kind of pinballing all over. But it seems like they're returning to they have however many spots, 5, 6, 10 spots that must just work for them. They don't get, shot at or mess with. And apparently they can slip out, even if they do run into people, like they feel like whatever they did worked and they'll return to them and stuff like that. And that's kind of what it seems like around here. I mean, you can, the very first buck I ever shot, I'd say that I would have shot any nice buck that came by, but like he was the one that was there consistently. And I was kind of, expecting to get a shot at him, I guess. That thing summered, like it was like 4 or 5 miles to the north of where I first got pictures of him. I got pictures of him the night that season opened at like midnight. So I'd assume, and I know this because I watched all summer, someone that I knew that hunted up the road. They had like a Facebook page where they filmed their hunts and stuff like that. And I was looking at all the trail camera pictures and stuff they were posting, and he was one of them. He's there all summer. That night at like midnight or 1 o'clock, this buck shows up, and he never really left. And he was like every 2, 3, 4 days I get a picture of him, and I never had a deer on camera that consistently, But he was just, at least what I had put together, he was bedding in a waterway between 2 standing cornfields with a bunch of mature oaks in it, and then the waterway went from 70 yards wide to like 30, and it kind of pinched down, and there was a bunch of like dogwood and stuff as it pinched down, and it seemed like he was bedding just more towards the middle of that block. There's another big chunk of timber the opposite direction that I'd assume other people were hunting. But I mean, the reason I got permission to this spot is because my buddy that my brother kind of got into hunting hunted there, and then he moved to New York, and I knew that like they hunted mainly behind his house. And I was just like, we had been into this spot before, and we had kicked bucks out of there. I'm just like, what about this spot? Like, I know he doesn't hunt there, and he's not living around here anyway, so I went ahead and asked his uncle, like, would you mind if I tried hunting in there? So he let me, and like I said, nobody was supposed to be in there for however long, like maybe 10, 15 years, nobody had bow hunted there. So that's probably why he was there as consistently as he was. But anyway, he's bedding in this little waterway between 2 cornfields, and he's kind of feeding his way up towards these bigger oaks at night. And I think what eventually happened, I think I hunted him twice there, and I knew he was in there, but I probably waited 3 or 4 weeks to hunt him just for the right weather, I guess. That was another deal where it's just like me and Zimmy and Riley and Weber are just in a group text talking about, like, they're kind of having to hold me back from going in there. And Riley's one person that I feel like is really good at timing things out right. And, we all agreed that whatever the weather was set up for me to go in there. And I hunted him for like 1 or 2 days, and then he bounced across the road because I think he got onto me, just, me walking in there. And so I hunted there one afternoon, and he was just hitting a series of scrapes, just throughout this whole field edge, and then he'd bounce across the road, and I guess there was more oaks over there. And so I'm set up over this scrape, and a bunch of does come filtering through the first night. And me and Zimmy had made a little food plot there, which we probably didn't even have to do. We could have just, been set up over the scrape. But anyway, all the does come filtering through, and it's like calm enough where I should hear deer coming. It's 20 minutes before dark, so I'm just going to get down while all these does are cleared out and get out of here. And, I knew I didn't have to touch a bunch of stuff on the way in. We had it kind of prepped where it's like my pants aren't dragging up a bunch of stuff, and I don't know if it mattered or not, but I feel like in a situation like that where you kind of know where you're going, if you can limit the amount of ground scent that you're laying down, I feel like that's important. So anyway, slip out of there, go back in, and the weather's going to be good again the next night, and does come through, small bucks, stuff like that, and all of a sudden here he comes, and I go to reach for my bow, and I'm trying to film all this stuff by myself too, and I got too many cameras. I'm trying to be Greg Clements, and I'm getting all my cameras going, and go to reach for my bow, and it's pretty, like, it's sunny like it is today. I grabbed for my bow and just wasn't looking at it. I was looking at the deer, and I bumped it, and it just starts swinging, and he caught the glare of it or something. And he's coming for this trail that all the other deer use, that it goes right underneath my feet pretty much. He looks for a second, and then he just goes off the course that he was on. and he starts skirting, and he's hugging tight to the edge of the corn, and he gets out where I realize he's not going to come within range, so I grunt at him a couple times, and he just comes charging in, and I hit him way low and back.
Yeah.
And but that was just like one of those deals where, he hadn't been hunted in there, so I mean, he didn't hesitate at all when he heard another buck in this spot that he had been kind of running for the last couple of weeks, it seemed like. And I don't know where I was going with that, but I guess one main point of that is like where he was originally bedded, and it might have been where he was coming from that day all the way across the road just because the weather was good. Like there wasn't much to it at all. Like there's, 3 or 4 real big mature oaks that were dropping acorns, and then just, good enough habitat where he can stand up and browse throughout the day, like pretty high stem count stuff. There's a lot of times around here, if there is any sort of buffer that they're not farming, it's probably going to be where there's permanent water, like a creek running through. Mm-hmm. And he was bedded right up against something like that, and that's where I found probably the most bucks and stuff like that around here. Every once in a while, you'll catch him out on like an isolated island in some of these fields, it seems like. But I feel like the permanent water is pretty darn important, especially for consistent bedding.
And early season especially, too. I feel that there's kind of a list that comes to mind of bedding areas that I would check in farm country that maybe wouldn't think about in a more timbered setting. Mm-hmm. And one of them is timber corners. So when the crops come out, it seemed like in my area, bucks would pop up in these timber corners, and they would just sit there because they could watch a whole bunch of different area in the fields. And it's kind of funny because we would bump these deer out of these field corners when we were younger, and we had no idea what we were doing. But inevitably, our approach had a hill behind it. This one particular property we hunted had a hill, and the guy told us, just always park over there, which looking back on it could have been the dumbest thing ever. But it just so happened to be right where the deer couldn't see us in one corner where they would bed. And there's all kinds of stories of me and my buddies like bumping big bucks out of there. Like one time my buddy was going into just hunting on a solo gun hunt and was just going to kind of still hunt his way through there, and just got in that corner, and all of a sudden he's in there with this big buck, and he looks over and the buck's looking at him, and as soon as it sees him, gets out of there. But field corners, man, timber corners are just something that I don't really see that in a ton of different spots, and some properties or parts of the country just don't have rectangular woodlots. But where I grew up, they're shaped all in a rectangle. There's rarely a curving boundary. Mm-hmm. Here there's a little bit more of that, but still a lot of corners.
Yeah.
Do you see that here too?
I do, yeah. I haven't hunted. When I was hunting around here a bunch, I never had permission to any real sizable acreage of timber, though. Like, honestly, I can't think of a spot where I had permission to where there was more than 1 acre of woods even, really. It was all just fence lines and then mostly waterways and stuff like that. And I guess that's why I ended up hunting on the ground a lot of times, and that's where I started hunting with my grandpa, too. It's like there's limited trees that you can get into, But
bedding though, I do want to kind of focus on that for a minute, because I feel like it is just so different. Waterways is one that you've mentioned multiple times, and my dad always tells a story of where he hunted his way through the cornfield, set up on the waterway, and just had a parade of bucks go past him early season. That always was something that came to mind when I was hunting these different areas. But I think if you could get a grassy waterway, one that's not mowed, one that has water in it, actually.
Some of my favorite spots early season, too, are like a fence line with a drowned out spot in like a cornfield where, it's just, you got a 10-foot barrier, and then in these wet spots, a lot of times there's just all sorts of different broadleafs that grow up, just because the corn doesn't come up, so that's not all canopied out, and you'll just get a variety of different plant types growing up in those drowned out spots, and they can be an acre plus a lot of times. And I mean, I guess I know how to talk to farmers enough around here where I can be like, hey, the weeds are getting out of control in that spot. You want me to go in there and broadcast some turnips or some radishes? They're not going to come up the next spring, so they're not going to be an issue for you to go off and kill, and it'll kind of canopy out and I guess, suppress the weeds from coming up. And I mean, I've done it too, where you go in there and you can even just spray whatever is coming up, and just do like a free little food plot. That's everything's already worked up. It's fertilized because they're farming it and stuff like that. But those are spots that after that corn comes out, I mean, I probably didn't really hunt there unless it sets up next to something, I guess, on the neighbors that they might just be pulling out of. But a lot of times you can just tuck right into that corn and be sitting in the standing corn, and that gets pretty intense because you're hearing deer coming through the corn. And a lot of times it's close quarters. My grandpa did that a lot. It seemed like back when he was younger. Corn rows were a lot wider then, so I think the deer were bedding directly in the corn a lot more. But they're still bedding right along the edge of it and in it some, especially in those ground out spots where the population of corn stalks, I guess, isn't as high. It seems like.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that came to mind when you mentioned fence rows is in a standing corn situation, if you've got a fence row that runs through it, you've got corn on either side of it, especially if you can pair that with, obviously water is a factor, but also oak trees that are dropping acorns.
Yeah.
I feel like that is just money, and it allows you to have
early season. They got shade with those big oaks too,
and they may shift their bedding around during the day, so even a middle of the day hunt in those situations can be beneficial because they may be following that shadow. Like I talked to Justin Syme one time at length about deer moving around a point. It was a finger, but how they would move around in the corn just based off where that shadow is hitting.
Yep.
I find that really interesting, but it just also allows you to have another option of a place to hunt that may not be good one year. Let's say it's beans. Yeah. Even if those trees are dropping acorns on that bean year, they may not be there if you can see it from the road or see it from houses and stuff. They probably won't be there.
Yeah. At the same time, though, it's like, I think bean fields around here, they'll bed in the bean fields during the summer around here and probably into season some, but then I get to thinking about like when we were in Kentucky, those deer were bedded, and the beans were taller than any beans I'd ever seen. They're about up to my neck, 5 foot tall beans, which is pretty wild to think about. But I mean, imagine how cool that is for a deer to be out in a bean field in the shade with the breeze blowing them, on them, and they can just stand up throughout the day. And I mean, all you can see is their neck. If they get, like where we were hunting at, there was a lot of fields that were far, far from the road. And that's where Warb ended up killing that buck. But there was a whole bachelor group of them out there, and we found several others too in that area that we were hunting, where deer just bedded right in, where they're feeding in the afternoon, just kind of following that shade around.
Something that is another one that I read a book by Roger Rothar one time, and it was really interesting to hear his take on cornfields. And one thing that really stuck with me was he would look for isolated single oak trees that would grow in the middle of a field, which is a really common thing. It definitely happens around here. I know
the farmers will leave them, I think, just out of respect for age, it seems like.
Yeah.
That's just like, they don't want to go cutting down a tree that's potentially 200, 300, 400 years old, which is pretty cool.
But you see that one lone tree, way out there.
Yep.
There is a turkey out there, by the way. I don't know if you've... Or maybe that's a raccoon.
No,
right
that's
on the
turkey, I think.
We need our field glass. But you see that isolated tree out there, and especially if it's dropping acorns, it's like if that thing is, 500 yards off the road or 1,000 yards off the road, or you can't even see it from the road, that's pretty interesting, because if he's got food with acorns and corn being there, he's got a lot of things going for him, and especially if it's close to water, or better yet, you pair it with a pond. Like one spot that would be attractive to me would be like a old cattle pond or something that would be in a field that's surrounded by corn that maybe has some willows growing up beside it. I feel like spots like that every time I see them. I mean, they're usually just on private, but I see them and I'm like, ooh, I'd love to go in there and check it out on a corn year, you know, just see what the heck, even just to see it.
But it seems like a lot of those farmers that, I mean, where you look at it, it's just like, I mean, maybe there isn't a tree on the whole place, but it, you know, if you're driving past, you see deer out there, or you know, there's good habitat that sets up right next to it. If it's standing corn, you don't need a tree. You got a 100-acre ground blind right there. You can sit wherever you want, and that standing corn slips through that and be set up right along the edge of it. And then I guess, you know, as the year goes on, I mean, my grandpa talks about doing a bunch. I've never done it and had success, but I've had a lot of fun doing it. And the times that I run into deer is just slipping through cornfields around here. It seems like they don't bed in them as much, because I think the corn rows used to be 40 inches wide or 38 inches wide or something like that, and now 30 is pretty common, but even down to 15 or 20 they'll do. So I imagine, you know, just a buck walking through that with any size rack, and, you know, just being able to lay down there comfortably and stuff like that is just not, doesn't seem like they bed in them as much as they used to. And that's just me saying that because, I mean, I don't have any experience with it more than, you know, within the last 10 years, I guess. But, I mean, if you can get in a cornfield, and it seems like the times I've run into deer is just in like low areas like that, close to low spots, like I mentioned earlier. But I mean, there's been several different times where they just think I'm another deer and they're coming in to fight me. You know, it's like a lot of times when I was doing it, it's just like a windy day, late October, early November, and they hear me coming, and all of a sudden I just hear an animal marching at me, and it's like, that gets pretty intense. There's one time I was down the road here, and I had just got, you know, out of the vehicle, and all of a sudden a deer goes running off. I'm 20 yards off the road. One deer went taking off, I'd assume was the doe, and then all of a sudden I hear grunting, and just like, you know, he's just trying to shout as loud as he can coming down. It ended up being the next row. It's like I'm hearing him come, so I drew back, and then it's like, I mean, I got to check to see where this thing's at, and I leaned out, and like he was like from media away, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he just went taking off. That was a pretty nice buck. And then just kind of ended up slipping my way through there. I think I found the doe that he was with, but I never could catch back up to him. But, I mean, that's just another opportunity that, I mean, until that corn gets picked, I mean, I guess that might not be worth hunting there. Did I say that right?
It might not be worth hunting after the corn gets
but
taken
there
down.
might be just, you know, a buck or two locked down with the doe in there, or Lord knows how many, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think one thing that's interesting too that I've read in other people's, either read or actually there was a video that was on YouTube there for a while that was I can't remember what that guy's name was. Can you remember?
I can't. Some old timer.
Yeah, but he was talking about how he had like one year hunted in Iowa and Minnesota and North Dakota and whatever, like 4 different states, and was killing bucks and standing corn in every one of them. But what he was doing was, even into the late season, just trying to find those last standing cornfields and just stalking his way through them. And if you can find it still, we'll try to pop up some text or something to tell you where to look, because it is a super educational video about how to hunt corn and this guy's experiences. And like Jake said too, there's probably some things that have changed with the rows being smaller now, but at the same time I think there's a lot of things that you could still apply, even though.
And I think when you're doing that too, you don't need to look at it as like there's 100 acres there. They could be anywhere. I mean, you could kind of look at your map and tell, like, I know there's a lone tree in that corner, and then they're not gonna just walk out into the middle of that thing for the most part.
They're gonna get lost.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason I think they use those trees, is they're using it as a visual cue to
say, beacon,
yeah, I'm going there. And it's the same thing you see in like a marsh, or I mean, you can see that on a map, on aerial image in a marsh, where they go straight to the trees. And the buck that Ted shot in Oklahoma, that was kind of farm country. There's this little tree, and that all those deer were going right to it. Ted just went and sat underneath of it and shot the buck out in the wide open otherwise, but there he went to that tree. Same thing goes for a cornfield. They're going to have something to go to, because, I mean, I'm not saying they're going to get lost, but, like you said, what's the point of going out in the middle of that thing?
I can't imagine it's very comfortable for them to walk out in the middle of this field right here when it's standing corn.
There's also no diversity. There's also no water, in a lot of situations at least, and I think that, therefore,
just be looking at your map. I mean, you'll be able to tell where the low areas of the field are, where there's like maybe a pocket of trees or something like that, and those would be the areas that I'd probably gravitate towards to start. And honestly, I probably wouldn't waste my time with just walking through the middle of it.
But yeah, I think relating it to some sort of additional cover is going to be helpful because, again, that's also going to be an added food source. Like we mentioned the oaks earlier, but there's all kinds of opportunities on an edge where, even looking just right here, I mean, you got some more variation in plants, and I think when you add that to the mix, it's just more enticing for them because they can feed on multiple things throughout the day.
Yeah.
Deer don't like to just eat one thing. I mean, even that buck that you killed in North Dakota, great farm country example where this deer lays out in the middle of the, what was that stuff called? Canola. I always forget that. But we don't have that where I grew up. And that buck would bed there, but what you had observed was just that he was going to get a little
something else.
A little different salad over here right on the edge of that corn.
Yep.
And I just think that's
another interesting thing about that too is that I don't know that we ever really talk about much, or people might not realize from the video just because we didn't get a ton of footage of it, is that we weren't even going after the buck that I killed. There was one that seemed like he was maybe a little older or bigger than him, or at least the same type of buck, but he had lost his velvet. And so that was just a big square section basically that we're going into. It was like a mile plus though from where I had last seen this buck specifically that we kicked up late. I watched him lay down, went and got Grant. We come back, and we're walking in, and like this thing had moved a mile in September. I'd assume he just walked, the edge of the field, and he got down right between two standing cornfields where he was in the shade. And I mean, it was for sure the same buck, and like last thing we were expecting to do was kick him up a mile away from where I had seen him. Luckily. So he gets up, I go taking off after him just because I know, like, when he gets out in this field, I'm going to be able to see him for a long ways. So if I get up to this corner, I'm going to be able to see a lot. And get up to this corner, and I crawled on top of that rock pile or shed or whatever it was and didn't see him. But I think when he went tearing through there, he got the other two bucks up on their feet, luckily. So it's like, well, we spooked one, but luckily there's three total, one small buck and then the one we ended up killing. But that's another type of spot where
which ain't no shrimp.
No, he ended up being a lot bigger than what he looked like from the road. So it makes me wonder what that other buck that he was hanging out with was that made me not that interested in him, while the other one was standing out there. But then obviously he ended up being pretty darn nice. But that's another spot too where, like, once all that crop comes out, I mean, unless he's locked down with a doe out by that,
probably ain't no reason that he'd ever be
because we were on the corner of 4 straight up. I guess there was a bunch of different. I guess it was corn, and then canola, and it would have been pretty barren out there after all that stuff gets harvested for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and not to say that you won't catch them doing something, but I mean, out in the middle of corn stubble is probably low odds even for a lockdown buck.
Yeah.
I think that something else that comes to mind when I think of bedding is oh shoot, what was I gonna say? Dang it, there was something right there. Oh shit. Nice. Oh. Okay, so this is a good. Another unique bedding opportunity that I've seen is power lines, because they'll create a unique habitat type that you don't see everywhere. So in my area, and actually the property that I talk about a lot hunting, it's the place that I hunted the most just because it was really close to where I lived. I could be there in a minute, but it had this power line that ran through it. And even when there would be those big power, I don't even know what you call them, like a giant tower, and that line runs for however far, even when they'd be out in the middle of the field, it would create this little pocket of diversity underneath of them. And I had seen where bucks would lay under those, especially with a doe or something. I watched a video one time where I watched a guy kill a gigantic buck in the flattest, most open farm country field under one of those things locked with a doe. And I think that in general, those things just create added diversity. And sometimes in farm country, I think one of the hang-ups is like if there's timber there, it's kind of just junk timber. Like there's no real reason that it's there other than maybe there's, I shouldn't say junk timber, but it's open timber.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not always a ton of diversity in it, at least in my
A
area.
lot of open canopy timber where it's not high stem count stuff that's just all kind of...
And really here I have noticed that the woods is a little bit more beneficial to the deer in general. Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of oaks in this area where there are oaks for sure where I hunted a lot, but there's also forests that would just be exclusively maple. And that has some food value to a deer, but not for the entire season.
Yep.
And I feel that when you find something that breaks it up, like a power line or
that property that we gun hunt on, like right where we shoot all the deer, you know, pretty much every year you can bet that they're going to be out in that open. There's a gas line that runs through there, so you know every 5 or so years they'll come through and clear that. You know, they'll just bush hog it, and you know after a year or two, it's like deer, all that dogwood and stuff like that starts to come back up, and it's just like a bunch of young regeneration that everything seems to flock to or swarm to. So just little stuff like that where stuff's getting disturbed maybe a little more than I guess the rest of the countryside.
The other thing too that I think about is to just simply dumb it down. And I think this, any size of timber lot, especially in farm country though, don't overthink it. Like, just go to those thickets, like if you're looking at an aerial photo and you can see there's a thicket or a swamp or some sort of difference, go check that out. And there's all kinds of examples too where we've still seen deer bed in those bigger tracks, especially if they're not getting bumped around too much. But anytime there's some sort of disturbance in a small wood lot, that's going to probably be the spot if they're in there. And as the crops come out, they're going to get funneled down to those spots more often. So if you are lucky enough to land permission or have public areas that have that diversity in them, don't be afraid to just go right to those spots too and check them out, or at least have a plan of how you would hunt them when they move into that in a given year or a given
and if they're in there, there's going to be sign that's going to be all those trees are going to be scarred up. And I think that's one thing too with the farmland stuff especially, is like you can count on deer coming back to those same areas just because habitat is so limited and cover is so limited. Like if they find a spot that works for them, they're just going to keep going back to it until they have a reason not to, it seems like. Like there's a buck, there's the one my mom ended up killing in the backyard here. He was coming out to a bean field down here a bunch during the summer, and I didn't know where, he was going to be bedded specifically. Like I just hadn't, went in there the year, and I should have just made time to do it the year before when, all the foliage was off and stuff like that, because he had been around for a year or two at that point, and he was probably a 4 or 5 year old buck the year that my mom killed him. I was like, I don't know where I know he's coming from along that ditch, but I don't know where, and I need to know, So it was early enough in the summer where it's just like, I'm just going to go in, like I know he's in there. I've seen him, however many nights in a row. I'm just going to go in there and spook him and see, where he's at, because I'm sure it's where he spends his time during the fall too. Just because around here that just seems like the case. Like other places in the country that I've been, it seems like they might shift, during the fall. But if wherever he was at down there, it seems like he'll if he's in this block or if he's using that area, he's just going to use that same exact bed, just because, like I said, cover's so much more limited. So anyway, I think me and Hayden went in there, and it's just like we just basically went in there like we were bow hunting. It's like, let's get as close as we can to this thing and make sure it's him if we can, and try to get eyes on him. We didn't get eyes on him, but we spooked
make sure he knows it's you too.
And so we go in there and spook this buck. I'd assume it was this buck. He'd been going out there about every night. How they do during the summer, they get pretty consistent with their actions. And so we go in there and spook him, and then it was getting towards the end of October, and he had moved to the north. I think Zimmy had seen him shining and stuff like that. I wasn't around, but started getting pictures of him and stuff down here, and I think I hunted him a couple times. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to go in there and like sit in the bed, that we kicked him out of during the summer. Still was standing corn where I felt like I could just get into that standing corn. The ditch that he was bedding along was 30, 40 yards wide tops. So I was just like, I'll just hang out in there. And if I, try to get in there early enough where I beat him back in there, and if he stands, even if he beds down, before daylight, I'll be somewhere close enough where, as he stands up throughout the day, which I know he's gonna, within a couple hours probably, I'll be able to shoot him hopefully. So I go slipping in there, and I am to the last row of corn, and I'm, I had really been taking my time, and there was a good amount before daylight, and I'm just kind of just shifting my feet around, getting them kind of planted where I'm going to be comfortable standing there for however long I need to. And it was pretty calm. And I'm like 25, 30 yards away from this bed. And all of a sudden, a deer gets up, heavy deer, hear antlers clanging, he takes off. Like he had probably been listening, but apparently I sounded enough like a deer or something until that point where he didn't care, but he took off out of there, and he beat me in there, and that was a good ways before it got light out. But I know that, like, when Joe shot that buck bedded a couple years ago, that's what he was doing too, is just like trying to beat him back into the spot. And I mean, he literally shot the deer came in and laid down underneath him before it got light out. But it was so specific of a spot that he was counting on him coming back in there, and I think you can do that a lot in farm country.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're going to be bedded either in that specific bed, or there's going to be a series of 3 to 5 of them, within 20, 30 yards, it seems like, which you can definitely use that to your advantage for sure.
I think that funnels are kind of an interesting topic in farm country because they can look kind of unique. I think there are funnels that are in the middle of a field, if that makes sense. Like, one thing I was thinking about was a big buck's ability and willingness to use the low spot in the field where he could walk what looks to be the wide open.
Yeah, you should be able to see him out there, but I know if a deer is standing in a lot of places in that field, you can't see him.
Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about that too. Like, even here, there's enough roll right there, especially in that corner right behind you. There's enough roll right there where a deer could sneak straight from that woodlot into that thicket right there and just keep on moving in broad daylight. And even if you were looking right at it, you wouldn't see him.
Yeah, a lot of times they would cut basically from the woodlot. They'd be coming from the CRP type stuff back there, but they would cut out of range basically of all the trees there, and on a west wind they'd just be kind of walking right downwind of a lot of that woodlot, because I'm sure people were hunting in there. But they'd be out in that open, getting downwind of all that stuff, and walk right into it. I mean, broad daylight. Because we hunted, I used to hunt back in there, pretty much all that stuff.
I just think that
big old drop time buck actually stood out there and fed on corn one night. In the same night, Hunter Borchard shot like a 3 or 4 point.
You watched the big drop time, and then Hunter went ahead and took the Magnum.
Yeah, there were several nice bucks, but hey,
Hunter went
he
hunting.
smoked them. Watched them fall.
I think that if you're willing to get out of the stand too in farm country, it's a pretty huge opportunity, maybe more than about anywhere. Because again, if you take the trends of what the majority of hunters are doing in a specific area, one thing that's definitely consistent where I grew up is there's a ton of tree stands in the timber.
Yeah.
But you get outside the timber and nobody's hunting in those places.
You can pretty much take any field corner around here and you're going to expect there to be some sort of stand in it. And the deer, if he's got any size to him, I'd like to think they know about most of that. So they're going to have stuff that they do that they're checking basically before they're going to put themselves at risk. Like I said, swinging downwind of all of the trees that someone could potentially be in, then going in. It's like they know they're safe. There ain't nothing that you're going to do to beat their nose.
No. And I just think that it's I don't know, man. I was thinking about this late last night. I really was coming back from talking with Hayden and Allie earlier. I'm driving middle of the night, and I'm thinking about tree stands, and I'm thinking about trail cameras. I'm thinking about all these things that hunters consistently leave in the woods. And I started laughing to myself because I'm like, man, how many times in my life I had to get into, an argument with somebody telling them that my belief is that deer know that your trail camera is there. But then I get to thinking about it even more, like your tree stand, your gigantic ladder stand, which I've hunted out of, and I have at my grandpa's place. But even just your ratchet strap on your tree stand, like, you kidding me? Like, they don't smell that? Like, as soon as you put that up, they're like, okay, right there is a danger zone.
Yeah.
And you talk about a 4 or 5 year old buck, and you talk about these isolated cover patches.
I've got a trail camera video you can put over it that covers exactly what you're talking about, where Nick shot that buck last year.
Uh-huh.
A big, 4 or 5 year old buck, or maybe it was a 3-year-old buck. I don't know. It's big for around here. It's like a 12-point buck. He sat in front of that camera where we were looking for blood in the corn. There's like 6 or 7 videos of this buck just like, because nobody had been in there the whole fall until then. And that's why he was in there within a couple of days when we were, I'm sure. Like, we were looking for Nick's buck, and it's like, well, there's something pretty big that's been spending some time in here, because there's just rubs, up to my chest and stuff like that. And we put a camera up because we didn't end up finding that buck, but we're just like, well, we'll see if he shows back up. And like, one of the first bucks that comes back is that deer, and you can tell he's just taking note on, like, he probably just followed everything we did. I've seen him do it before. I remember Todd Prignitz posting a cool video like that too. He had, he was hunting a specific deer and had a close call with him, and he's just like, I think he ended up busting the deer. But that buck just came back, like, I think it was within a couple of hours, and when he spooked him, and you could tell he's just like sniffing around, just kind of taking note of everything, everywhere that he had been, it seemed like. And I think they do that for sure. It seems like at least some deer will do that.
I mean, you got isolated cover. You got hunters that are habitual. You got a buck that lives out there every day of his life.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do a lot of convincing and a lot of studies or some scientific proof to make me believe that they don't know exactly where all that stuff we leave in the woods as hunters is.
Mm-hmm.
There's just, I don't know, feel pretty strongly at this
I
point.
follow my dog around enough to know that, like, as much as what she picks up on, it's interesting to see, to know a deer can smell better than that. It's like, well, I'll send her after my arrows that I missed the target with, and then there's stuff that I'll leave, I'll lose in the woods, and I know I lost it somewhere along the way that I'll have her go back and find days later. It's like, yeah, a deer that spends, she's a pretty pampered dog. A deer that, just like you said, lives its whole life out there. They're pretty familiar with everything that's going on out there.
They get in tune.
I think
with their
I
surroundings.
forget that, and everybody probably does.
Absolutely.
Think about when it's, snowing or raining. It's like a turkey's out there holding onto a tree limb that night and stuff like that. Just think about how in tune they are with everything that's going on out there. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I think we go hunting and we become a part of nature, and I think for a lot of us that's what we like about hunting. But it's obvious why a mature buck is so much better than us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he wins the game 9 out of 10 times because he does it every day. We go inside. We are pampered too.
Yeah.
It's like, your dog's pampered. It's like, son, like, oh, it's raining outside. I'm not going to go hunting today. Well, that buck's out there doing something. And I think too about anything that we hunt in the fall, deer and elk and all that. Like, what are they doing when it's the last thing we're thinking about? We're out there fishing in June, or we're out on the boat, on a family vacation.
They're still thinking about us a little bit.
They're still out there doing their thing, and they're still gaining experience that we're not. Even in a 5-year-old buck's lifetime, for straight up 5 years, he's in tune every single day because he's surviving, and we go out there,
because he has no choice but to be in tune.
Right.
Like, that's his life, is just trying to survive. I guess that's what everybody's trying to do, but not as many things are trying to kill us as they're trying to kill a whitetail deer or turkey or whatever, humans pursue, really.
Yeah, other than the government.
Well, they just flew by the whole scene by, checked out what was going on around here, and then hit the gas. That's what I like to think, at least.
We're here. Y'all are doing okay. One thing that I noticed when I was back home, where I grew up, kind of the last few times, was funnel wise, something that I think I overlooked when I was a kid was just down to timber. I'd look through that flat woods and I'd be like, man, how would you ever pick the trail? But there are certain little things that can create these funnels, and you almost have to look at funnels on a more micro scale, where I think when you're hunting, like, for example, big mountains in some of the areas that I've hunted in the east, you may look at a saddle that's this gigantic terrain feature that deer might be going up and over to save themselves hundreds of feet going up. And in that situation, this is a really big, obvious funnel. But sometimes in farm country, when you're looking at these little parcels, there might be these, I guess I would call them micro funnels, which might just be a tree's down, and then maybe there's a little wet spot here, or maybe it's just some thicker vegetation, whatever it may be. Looking at micro funnels and looking at anywhere we can pick up a trail, because one of the best hunts I ever had was on that same property that I talked about at the beginning where the corn was. There was a little pond in there, and I don't know if it was just kind of a natural wet area, if it was an old cattle pond of some sort, but regardless, it was just this maybe a quarter-acre little pond just inside the timber. And my buddy and I were squirrel hunting in there. I know I've told you this story like 500 times, and maybe y'all listening have heard it 500 times too, but it's one of my favorite memories because
it's an easy story to visualize, though, because I think everybody's done something similar.
We were up there squirrel hunting, me and my buddy Isaac, and we were walking through the edge, and there was a bunch of big oaks right there. And, you know, in hindsight, I'm sure they were just dropping acorns like crazy, and that's probably why he was there, because this was an early season hunt when this happened, or at least at the latest, mid to late October. But we went in there squirrel hunting and found this trail going right along the side of that wet area. And I guess at that time, I had never really seen a trail. I know that sounds silly, and I know there were trails that I wasn't picking up on, my ability to see them.
It's when the light bulb finally went on for you, though.
Yeah, and it was like, this is a just straight line right down through here. And I think there was actually even a couple scrapes on it. But they were getting pinched down by that water. And I ended up going back in there and hanging in a climber, and was just in this tree that was close to that trail. And it was one of the few trees I could get my climber in, and it didn't work out because fast forward to last light, I'm losing confidence. And actually, Isaac was sitting on the other side of that pond, and I'm starting to lose confidence. And all of a sudden, I look down in there, and I see a deer moving, or I heard a deer moving. And I hear a deer rubbing. Sure enough, here comes this really nice buck, like one that I was very surprised to see coming out of there. And he came right down that trail and got right under my stand. He's quartered to, and he saw me up there and jumped and bounded right to 20 yards, but he was quartered away. And on high alert, I was shooting a super slow bow, old bow, aluminum arrows still, and he you know, totally, when I shot, I would guarantee that deer dropped down, and I'm sure I didn't aim low enough, and I just hit him on the top of the back, and he definitely lived, because my dad saw him later, you know, a couple weeks later. And almost, actually, my dad had a gimme on him, but it was too dark. He came to the scrape that he was on, and the other little woodlot that was right there,
yep,
and just decided that he couldn't see his pins well enough.
Uh-huh.
And that's good. That's a good, whoa, that phone gets a little weird. But it was just a cool hunt, because, like you said, the light bulb went off. It was like, wait, that is a funnel right there. And then after that, I was always able to see those a little bit better. And I would say, as time goes on, I've just continued to get better. And I mean, being able to see little trails like that has just gone a really long way for me. It helps me visualize and anticipate movement.
Seems like around here the best funnels are, you know, those buffers that are a little wider between fields, and a lot of times, like I said earlier, they got water in them, where, you know, like I can think about this river back here, creek, I guess it is. Both sides of it, there's 10 yards of, just pretty high stem count stuff. And on that, there's on the one side, there's it's a rise in elevation. But the deer, through the years, as thick as it is along there, there's a trail, like a little tunnel, really, that's deer height that they can cruise up. And I'm sure the amount of bucks that cruise up and down that thing, I've seen it, they stay in that cover. I mean, and they can cruise that for a mile plus that I can think of, and probably for longer than that, and never be seen by anybody from the unless somebody was in a tree stand. I mean, or when they're crossing the road and you're not going to see them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge, long funnel where you could catch deer making big moves. And as this creek goes, there's little spots where it jets out and gets wider, and that's where does will bed and other bucks. And I mean, it's pretty easy for him to get the right wind and just run down that and check a pretty big swath of country, really. And another thing I wanted to talk about, too, before we wrap things up is decoys. When crops do come out, that's when the decoy comes. And I'm sure Greg's just got a ton of footage of that. But, I mean, anywhere where, a deer can see
honestly, you could probably just set up right here with a decoy in the right situation. You get a buck fired up enough.
Yeah.
You never know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can get a little bit more lenient with your setup.
Get it out there, wherever the wind makes sense for you, where they hopefully can't get downwind of you, and then be ready to call at them as soon as they should be able to see that decoy. Just make sure you got stuff where you can get loud enough where they can hear you.
Mm-hmm.
Get your rattling antlers, get your grunt call, and be ready to, if you're in a tree, I'd have some stuff tied up to like a string to make some sort of ground noise, because they're going to sit there and look at it for a good while if they've been called at for a while. But the more realistic you can sound, and if you can get a decoy out there, that'll a lot of times sell them, it seems like. And that's a pretty fun and effective way to get them in bow range. And a spot like that where it's just like, he could just be cruising across the middle of that field, and there's not really a great reason for him to go in anywhere specific. But if you can throw a decoy out in front of you, that definitely can increase your odds, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think something else that I was thinking about that is worth noting, too, in farm country is obviously fields are kind of a clean slate when it comes to finding tracks. I think that's something that, as far as scouting goes, we talk about rubs and scrapes and stuff all the time, but just simply finding tracks. And I actually was talking to Andy May a couple weeks ago, and he was telling a story about a buck that he shot in Michigan and stuff that I'm visualizing being pretty dang similar to this around here and where I grew up. And turkey's back out, and I got slightly distracted. But he talked about how when he was trying to find where that buck was moving from one woodlot to the other, he was just finding these big tracks going across the middle of a field, and therefore when he picked his setup, he was within range of that, big buck track going across the field. And it's like, you think about all the situations where you find tracks going into a spot, especially in stuff like this, and it's like, well, maybe he is running through the middle of that field, but if you can find any way to intercept them along the way, and again, if you can get and are willing to get out of the stand, then I think that opens up even more opportunities, because maybe he's crossing a little waterway where you can tuck down in some grass or a little bit of willow brush or something like that. And I really like that idea of tracks, and you can check a lot of these spots that we've talked about, like maybe a transition between corn and a fence row, or even just entering and exiting fields in general. I feel like that's a huge starting point, right? Like, again, I'm always thinking of it from the standpoint of not having trail cameras. Like, how do I know one's there? Well, I want to look down that edge and just say, okay, these trails and these are mostly does coming out of here, but that's the buck trail. You find his track going in and out of there, and you can use that to your advantage.
Yeah, and in a state like this, you can spotlight at night. Use that to your advantage for sure.
Absolutely.
You can cover a lot of ground and not have to put any sort of scent in whatever area you're hunting, and learn a lot about what's going on, an hour or even a couple hours after dark, and, just seeing which way a deer's going. Maybe he's on this field, right after dark, and then, 2 hours later he's down there where you can hunt. Well, on your best weather day, he might end up way the hell down there, you know. So at least you know he's around and he's willing to use that piece of property, you know.
I like the track thing. I just find that so helpful. And another thing that I actually talked with Joe about today is something that's really easy to pick up on in farm country, I feel like, is field entrances from the woods, just that visual hole where some trails that are doe trails are pretty narrow, but that big wide 20-inch sun coming through there, he's going to bust a little bit of bigger hole through there just because his body's bigger, he's taller, and he's got antlers on his head that are wide and tall. So therefore a little hole that he's coming in and out of might even be a visual thing. Like, there's a lot of times where I'm driving down the road and it's, you know, just some random place and it's like, well, that's that spot. You can just see that that's the hole where, not to say that he's doing it in daylight or it's absolutely the place you're going to catch him, but it might be a place to start. If you don't get him there in daylight, maybe you backtrack down that trail and that's going to kind of give you that line. I just think stuff like that is pretty easy to pick up on when you have that limited cover that farm country offers pretty often. See that? I'm pretty sure I don't actually see him right in this moment, but I'm pretty sure back behind, in between here and the next brown field, I'm pretty sure he's right there. Do you see the
I just saw something.
He just keeps, like, you see him pop up, but then
there's like a grass waterway that he's on the closer side of.
But when he was further to the left a little bit ago, and you could see him plain as day, and it was like, it looks like a big bird. Nah. Get distracted by these turkeys, and we'll never get done. I think we can... Is there anything else, I suppose, that comes to mind? I mean, I guess, for me, there's a million things about farm country that make it fun and unique and have these extra challenges, and I feel that it's probably a topic that we should try to keep talking about.
Yeah, I think we could pick apart more specific topics. Like, we could just talk about I guess the first thing I think about is access. Is like how careful you got to be with that. Just knowing you could be seen from several hundred yards away, and how much I missed, like, just driving around all these spots I used to hunt, just thinking about all the deer that I probably sent running the other way, or just sent laughing the other way.
Just like,
here
we go.
Not to my stand yet, so.
I mean, I used to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, most people do. I mean, we see people do it. I mean, you'd be driving down the road and be like, oh boy.
We just saw people doing it turkey hunting the other day. There was some turkeys out in the field. Well, there were turkeys in the field, and then they started walking across the field towards where they were, and they weren't.
Just be thinking about what the animals can see from where you anticipate them to be bedded for starters, I guess, and then think outside the box. Think about areas you can't see from the road where big bucks can isolate themselves.
It's actually a good point, too. Like, even just from a feeding standpoint, something that I remember my dad always telling me when I was a kid, and I started ultimately focusing on a lot, was anywhere where I could hunt that you couldn't see from the road was pretty dang cool, because, like, right here, we can see the other road over there, I think.
Yep.
Most places you can. They're 1 mile by 1 mile blocks. And if you can see the other road, there's a lot of times you can see all of the field that the deer might be going into. But if you can find a place that has fence rows or is this like isolated field inside of timber, I think those places are just incredibly good. I mean, they're kind of the places where you might actually find one going out in the open in daylight, because if you can't see them from the road, feels pretty comfortable. You probably can't hear the road or anything like that. So I think that was another thing that I had kind of listed for topics, was just trying to find those places too. And they might be right under your nose, like you said, because I'm looking at one right now, because that hen turkey just popped out, and I can't even see her again because she keeps going behind the low spot. That's right under our nose, and you could easily overlook something like that, because that spot behind Jake, I think you can see it in that camera. But that spot behind Jake is kind of obvious that it's a rise, but there's so many places in farm country fields that are just these little divots that you can't even tell.
And where years where, say both those fields are standing corn, I mean, you definitely can't see it until November. There goes that bird along the back there. Oh, turkeys.
here we are we're forcing it talking about deer right now too, everybody. We really just
No, I'm starting to get fired back up about it.
I'm fired up about it because I didn't get the turkey hunt that much. But trust me, when I see that turkey, I start thinking, man, I wish it was still turkey season. But I think that if you guys have any questions, leave questions in the comments or anything that you would like us to dive into more detail about, because I think this is something that we both enjoy talking about because we had so many experiences, and Greg as well, and Aaron. I mean, really all of us hunted a lot of farm country as kids. We all really did grow up in
and we also
country.
just did a bunch of short tip videos for the deer school too, where we talked about, honestly, we talked about a lot of different things than what we talked about today, so that's good, I guess. So check out the deer school too.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody, and feel free to send your suggestions our way about farm country or any other topics you'd like to hear, and we'll catch you on the next one.